Greetings, Kerbinauts. This is Kerbal Space Program. I'm Bob Fitch, and this is episode number 17 of Project Ares. I'm still waiting for my real solar system install to be ready to use again, which means I cannot do Project Alexandria, and I cannot do the real solar system part of this series. So we are still checking out Galileo's planet pack. Last episode, we had left off with this crew launcher that was on its way up to the new space station, which didn't have a name, by the way. Well, the Kerbals here know about the planets from Earth, and so in honor of that, they're going to call this the Mars Space Station. This is an unmanned flight. It's a test. We're writing down all the things that are wrong with the launcher before we put Kerbals in it. I also haven't tested the launch escape system yet, so that needs to be done. And the first problem we noticed was the big gap between the engines and the engine effects. So that was the first thing that I fixed. I showed you last week how I do that. I bring up the smoke screen mod, make sure that a real plume effect is attached to the engine, and then just manually edit all of the values until I get something I like. In this case, real plume hadn't even been attached to the engine yet, so that I did first in a config file, and then when I came in here the second time, I was able to get the smoke screen to start manipulating the engine, although the flare had been buried deep inside down toward the base of the engine, so there were a lot of things that needed to be modified in this to get this one working. You'll see the true flame effect once we do the real launch and any future launches that use this same engine. The next problem with this launch is similar to what happened with my SRBs in the previous episode. These aren't SRBs, these are liquid tanks and liquid engines. But just the same, the first set burned out too quickly a moment ago. In the SRB case, we could put a thrust curve on there, which lowered the thrust over time, allowing them to last longer. In this case, it's not going to be a curve. I can simply reduce the thrust on just those two engines because they had been added in the VAB separately as two pairs of two side boosters. All of the fuel drains out of the first pair before it drains out of anywhere else. They do that by draining them into the second set of boosters, and then the second set drains its fuel into the center. That way we lose one pair, and then later the second pair, and then finish off by draining all of the fuel from the middle, which hasn't been used up to that point. Currently, to maintain stability, the fuel drains like this. We drain 1, 2, 3, then drop this booster, and drain 4, 5, 6, and then drop this booster. But if I wanted to extend these even longer, make that engine burn just a slightly longer before I have to drop it, I could drain the fuel like this instead. We go with this one first as 1, then 2, 3, 4, drop the booster, and then finish off with the last tanks, and then drop that one. But since I'm already limiting the thrust on that left side engine, there may not be much reason to do that sort of a fuel setup. Unless, of course, after dropping that first set, our thrust weight ratio is too high. I like to keep it less than 2 until we get to a higher altitude. It's either that or throttle down as we're flying, and most of the time I like to not worry about the throttle. I like to have set up my engines ahead of time to thrust at the proper amounts, or put curves on things like the SRBs, so once again I don't have to really deal with the throttle, I just steer it. And besides, that sort of one throttle setting thing is very similar to what I'm doing in real solar system and feels more realistic to me, even though this is my Galileo planet pack install. The remainder of the flight didn't have many issues prior to releasing the fairing, so we will skip ahead to that, except for I will comment on how I don't really like the way that I used up only part of the fuel getting up to the high altitude that we're going to want to do a rendezvous with the station. I'd rather use up all of the fuel and then decouple and go to a different stage, but what I'm worried about here is that if I decouple that lower stage without using as much as possible, then the final stage I have may not be enough fuel to do the complete rendezvous and still be able to come back later. I don't know because I haven't tested it out yet. So what I did was throttled down way low and just let it go very slowly until we got our altitude higher, closer to our apoapsis, and then throttle back up again. I did that to use as much fuel as possible, but not so much that our periapsis comes out of the atmosphere. That way when I do decouple, that lower stage will still burn up. But in the future, I may want to make a change. Completely restructure this so that by the time we reach about 150 to 200 kilometers altitude, which is going to be high enough in order to reach any kind of space station, then all of the lower stage engines will be shut down and everything decoupled, but I'll still have another stage for circularizing and then the final tank for rendezvous and the return retro burn. Either that or ensure that that upper stage will always be able to do all of those, to circularize and rendezvous and return home later. Okay, so now we check out our next problem, and you can see that when we decouple the lower stage, it pulls away a little fast, and once again I have an issue with an interstage there. It sort of clips through the engine and doesn't stay attached to the lower core, which I had anticipated, so there must be something wrong with the decoupler module. Also, the fairing, when it goes, I keep forgetting to do that. It goes as confetti instead of clamshell. And finally, there's the KW fairing base. After seeing it here in orbit like this, I decided that I didn't like how it stuck out and I wanted to use a different base. So when I go back to the VAB to make changes for all the other things that I've found along the way, I also changed that base to make it more in line with the rest of the rocket. The reentry module decoupling test was also a problem. It looks like the KW fairing decoupled the other decoupler, which was in turn connected to the heat shield. So now there's two things floating down there behind us when I wanted to keep them together and only have one. Moving ahead to the re-entry test, I learned that we should be decoupling the living module that's on top of the return capsule much earlier than hitting the atmosphere. I decoupled it as we had already crossed into that last 70 kilometers where the atmosphere is, and it heated up so fast. Also, I had put a remote control probe on the living quarters so that I could operate this unmanned in orbit, but didn't remember to put one on the capsule itself, so after decoupling, the parachutes can't be opened. And now before really launching, we need to test the launch escape system. Our first attempt didn't even leave the pad. It was supposed to be a pad test. I fixed the decoupling problem, the fairing was holding it in. We go to a second test, but the SRBs are not strong enough and it lifts it up a little, but it sits on top of the rocket. The parachute functions correctly, but it's probably not going to be so good if we impact the launcher right after we decouple. My thought was if I add one extra SRB that gives it a little bit of sideways motion, then after it separates from the launcher, it'll get pulled away off to the side. That's the same thing that the Apollo launch escape system did as well. It almost worked. We cleared the launcher, but it was really close, a little too close for my liking. We also go into an uncomfortable spin, and after decoupling the living quarters, they almost impact the capsule on the way back down. That explodes the launch pad, and then we go parachuting serenely down into the raging inferno. Maybe not ideal, but I know what I need to do now. I need to strengthen that launch escape. I need to keep it going sideways a little bit longer and remove that extra time on the one SRB that was making it spin, and that should give us a nice test. And with that, as all things go well, we can go for the real manned launch heading up to Mars Station. Now, because as we found out previously that we are not launching from the equator, that means back when I launched the station, it was not in an equatorial orbit, which means we need to rotate around here a little while for the launch center to come underneath the orbit. And it just so happens that the station is almost perfectly lined up for a launch in the very first attempt. You can see right here, this is about how much space I'm going to want between the approaching station and my launch center as it goes underneath. So we quickly switch down to the ground and give it a go. On board today we have Riza Kerbin, she's one of our 3 pilots, and Saul Kerbin, one of our engineers. He will be, of course, responsible for fixing any of the problems that are found once we can reach the space station. Hopefully there will be none, but we figured we should send an engineer just in case rather than a scientist first. The capsule only holds 2, so we'll be sending up 2 at a time like this. This craft will stay docked to the space station and serve as the escape craft should anything go wrong. Since the station was in just the right spot for a launch, I'm using my standard ground-to-orbit technique, where I get it started, but then I throttle either all the way off or just down quite a bit, which gives me the time to make a maneuver node to set up an intercept, a close approach with the thing that I'm going after, while I'm still suborbital. Sometimes it takes 2 maneuvers like that, depending upon what kind of ship I am and where I'm going, but usually it allows me to get really close to the target while we're still suborbital, and then we can circularize, essentially making our rendezvous in about 10 minutes time as far as the Kerbals are concerned, and for that matter me too. I can do it in about 10 minutes. The lower stage decouples okay here. The fairing, I wouldn't mind if it decoupled a little bit better. Also remember previously I said I wanted to put an extra stage below this one, but above the main stage, with the idea being that that might be a restartable stage. Since normally a lower stage like the one I had wouldn't be restartable, but I did use it as a restartable engine. Now from this point, theoretically it should be a relatively straightforward rendezvous. However, somehow I messed something up. We're currently only 4-something kilometers away, and the close approach says we're going to come within about 3 kilometers. Everything seems like it has gone perfectly. We use the RCS system to try and fine-tune our approach and get a little bit closer, and hopefully we're going to be there within minutes. But the next thing you know, I'm using up a lot of RCS trying to get there. I start getting a little concerned that I might use up too much of it and I won't be able to rendezvous. So instead we go for a longer intercept. We're going to go for several hours. But then after orbiting for a bit, it turns out that that isn't going to be several hours. It's going to be over a day of orbiting. This got me concerned that we were going to run out of electrical power. Well, I have down inside some compartments on the side of the service module a solar panel that I can extend, as well as some fuel cells, but the fuel cells operate on monopropellant, and so I didn't want to turn them on because we were already running low on monopropellant. So we use the solar panel instead, rotate the craft so that it points at the sun, recharge the batteries a bit, and then continue on trying to get to our new maneuver node. But like I said, that's taking a long time. So ultimately I decided to lower my periapsis on one side, to reduce how long it was going to take, make it not be a day to get into position, but just a couple hours. And then we do a final maneuver that puts us back into a second intercept, and even though the RCS is getting really low, this time it looks like we're going to make it. Now on the bottom of the craft, I have 4 small maneuvering engines, much lower thrust, not quite as good of an ISP, but a lot lower thrust, that allows me to do more fine maneuvers, but it uses the liquid fuel and oxidizer rather than my RCS monopropellant. So to conserve that, I start using those, which is exactly what I had planned on using these for. I have some action groups that allow me to toggle back and forth between using the one big main engine or the 4 smaller ones with the lower thrust. That ultimately gets me into position. We make that final burn, make the rendezvous. As the RCS mono is getting quite low, come up on the station and get ready to dock. I'm being very careful with my monopropellant usage here. I definitely, at this point, we've spent so long getting here, I don't want to run out just as I'm there. That happened to me one time where I didn't pay attention to how much I had, and I spent a long time getting to the station and lots of mono like it was going out of style. And just before I docked, I ran out and I couldn't control the craft and it just floated away. That also reminds me of the first time ever that I was trying to dock. I think I spent about 4 hours and all of my monopropellant in my craft trying to get there and just couldn't figure out how to do it. The second time I attempted docking, it took 2 hours, but I finally did it. Now, if I wanted to go ground to the station in about 5 or 10 minutes, I probably could with just about any kind of craft. Just shows if you stick with it, you can eventually learn to do all these crazy things. So here we are, we're at the station, and I'm checking out all of my resources in the alternate resource panel over there, looking at how much I have in terms of supplies, electrical power, mono, fuel. We're also generating mulch. We spent a while getting here, so we have a bunch of mulch, which is the byproduct of the Kerbals just living when you use this life support system. There's also material kits, and I haven't really researched what those do yet, so I'll be doing that soon. And finally, I pull up the user interface for the life support to see how many days I have, and it looks like it's only about a month, so I'm going to want to bring up a whole lot more supplies. But before I launch supplies, I want more habitation space. Remember I said I'm using USI's life support system. I'm not using TAC, even though over in the resource panel you can see a whole bunch of indicators for things like food and water and carbon dioxide, and those would be for TAC. My parts, my install, something in it must be confused and it thinks it needs to load my ship with that. But I don't. I only need supplies, and those get turned into mulch. But using USI's life support also requires habitation space. And so I need to get some more space because I want to have 2 ships up there. There'll be a pilot in each. There'll be 2 pilots, 1 engineer, and 1 scientist. And that will be my regular crew. So we're doing a test launch right now. Like I've done on all of my other craft in this solar system, I'm writing down all of the things that I find that are wrong with it. We'll fix those up and then we'll launch the real version. And the first thing I notice is that the engines may not be attached to real plume. So I had quickly pulled up the smokescreen interface and looked, but it did look like they were there, and as I get higher I do see that the engines have the real plume effect. So I was wrong at the beginning, they were working correctly. But as I got closer to decoupling that lower stage, I realized I forgot to put retro rockets, and that's why I had paused to grab a pad of paper that I could write down the things that I'm going to find as I go. By the end of this first test flight here, I had found 10 different things that needed to be fixed. The retro rockets for stage 1 was the first of those. The second problem was that the interstage, just like has happened several times now, was not set up correctly for that tapered decoupler, and it broke away from the main lower stage when I didn't want it to. Then the next thing after that was I forgot once again, just like back when I was new to KSP and I would forget to put out my solar panels when I made it to orbit, which at least I don't do that anymore, but now I still constantly forget to disable my RCS on the payload because I don't want it enabled until I get to orbit, and I want to create a toggle, an RCS action group toggle, in order to activate that. So that's the next 2 things, the RCS disable and to create a toggle. After stage 1 was decoupled, I noticed that I didn't really like the color of the engine base on stage 2, so I figured I could toggle that too, because that's one of those SSTU engines, and the bases on those can be modified to various shapes and colors using tweakables in the VAB. Then the next thing was the fairing. 2 problems there. I want to increase the decoupler power on the fairing so it pops further away from the body of the craft as we're going, and I need to move it lower down in the staging so that it decouples earlier than I had originally thought it might. Here I took a look at the engine effects for stage 2, and I was thinking they might need to be modified. They might be up a little too high inside the engine bells, and I might want them a little bit lower. When we get around to decoupling stage 2, I think I'm going to reduce the solid fuel that's in the retro rockets because they burn too strong. It pulls away really fast, and I probably just need a short burst. So if I reduce the amount of fuel, that should have the effect I'm looking for. And finally, when we test the payload decoupling, that's a little too powerful as well, and I want to reduce the decoupler power on that. After that, I didn't find any other problems, and so I went to the VAB and made all those changes, and then we could head out for the real launch, and that will give me an opportunity to tell you about USI's life support and what it's going to mean to my game. I downloaded USI life support off of the Kerbal forums, and by installing this, now I have to deal with supplies, as I mentioned. Those are going to get consumed at a rate of 1.8 supplies per hour and converted into mulch. If the supplies run out, then by default, the Kerbals get grouchy, but I've increased the difficulty setting. And now if mine run out of supplies, they will eventually die. Also, as part of the life support, you need electric charge and habitation space. The electric charge should be easy for me to manage. I'm just going to have the solar panels and the batteries, and so they'll always have enough electricity. Now in the supplies, if they're using 1.8 per hour, and I want to go with something, say, 6 months worth of supplies, and we have 4 Kerbals, so at 30 days per month roughly, 24 hours a day, 1.8 per hour, multiply all that together, and we get over 30,000 supplies will be required. However, you can do some recycling of the mulch back into supplies. If I'm not mistaken, I'll need an extra resource called fertilizer in order to do that, but I'm not worried about the supplies yet. I'm worried about the habitation space. When I get around to supplies, instead of 30,000, over 30,000 being needed, if I do that recycling, I should probably need only about 10% of that, so maybe 3,000 supplies, and that'll be much more manageable. Then we won't have to resupply more than once every 6 months, and eventually we might even be able to go longer. Now in the habitation space, the way that works is every seat, every crew capacity that a module has adds a little bit of habitation space. Then modules have an extra value that says that that's how much bonus space for habitation that module has, and that sets a limit for how long your Kerbals are going to be willing to live in that area until they want to go home or at least have a change of scenery. It's all measured in Kerbal months, which is Kerbin days of 6 hours each. Now sometimes there's a module that will have a bonus on it, a hab multiplier. Those are usually special things like cupolas or something that allow them to look outside, and it makes them less homesick, and therefore you take the whole value with the base number of months that you can have, plus however much you get from the number of seats, the crew capacity in that module, and you multiply all this by the hab multiplier, which is usually 1, but with a cupola or other things that add more to your hab multiplier, it can go up from 1 and give you much more space. Ultimately, once you get that whole value figured out, that's how long your Kerbals will be willing to live in that location until they want a change of scenery and potentially eventually when they want to go home, because there are 2 internal values being stored. The first value is how long the Kerbal has been in the same location, and every time they change locations it resets, but there is another second value that tracks how long they've been away from home entirely, and once they reach that, they need to go home, and there's apparently nothing that can be done about that one. Now I know all of this just by reading the website. I haven't actually used it, and so we're going to find out with first-hand experience. This module I'm using to rendezvous at the station right now is going to be my habitation central core. It has a middle section that has four docking nodes. One of them already has a module on the end of it, so there's 3 extra docking nodes. It also has a cupola on the end of the small habitation module and on top of the inner core. The hab module at the end is a personal living space. The middle is a shared common area. I'll be docking 3 more of those personal living spaces, giving them 4 personal living spaces. The middle area has exercise equipment, a big flat screen TV, mini bar, disco ball, that kind of thing. So here we are, we've put it into position where now on just the RCS I should be able to reach my target and dock up. However, I find another problem I had forgotten to check for and didn't fix. The last stage that got us here, it doesn't have a probe core for automatic deorbiting and clearing up of itself as debris. When I switch over to it to check on it, I realized that it's uncontrollable. At first I thought maybe it was out of electrical power, and then no, I realized it wasn't that, it was that I can't control it. So in the future I'm going to have to make a change, put a probe on there so that I can control it for deorbiting. But this one is controllable. The module, we can now get it into position and dock it up. Down in the VAB I had already used my RCS build aid to make sure that the RCS was in the right positions to make it very controllable. And sure enough, it is very easy to maneuver it into position and get it all docked. You can see I was having a lot of fun with my 6 degrees of freedom mouse floating all around the outside, watching as I come in. And soon I will finally get to tell you all about those docking nodes that I said that I would explain. I'm about to use them right now. Well, actually, first I need to reload, because right as I went to use the docking ports, the game crashed and I had to load from the save point right as I was still coming in, and I had to redock it all over again. So, about these parts. They are auto-welding docking nodes. Once you have them in position, you have your modules in position, you select both sides and you tell them to arm themselves. That causes each side to retract a little and get into its final spot. And once you have that, then you hit weld, and the 2 parts will disappear, and the 2 connection points that they were on will essentially dock together as if they had been docking nodes. After that, they can no longer be separated, and it all becomes one vessel forever. That removes the 2 parts, the docking nodes on both sides, and since it's all one vessel and not 2 docked vessels, it improves the physics simulation so the game goes faster. I've retracted and armed one side, but I had trouble getting the other one. At first I thought I clicked on it and I actually got the top one, then I clicked on it again and I got the bottom one instead. Finally, I got the right one, retracted it, told it to weld together, and then I extended the top and bottom ones that I had done accidentally. I need those ready for the next dockings that are going to come up soon. So here we go. Boom! Welded together. Two crafts become one.
So, you're telling me, this galaxy...
Yes, sir. It may be the same one the humans are from. We've finished analyzing the night sky and star positions, and the information matches what Earth was able to send back to Kerbin before communication was lost. Here, let me show you. This is what we have analyzed from here on Gale. This is a highly zoomed out view of their universe. As we fly in closer here, we can see their galaxy that they call the Milky Way. They are located on that marker right there. As we zoom in closer, through their Milky Way galaxy, we can see their solar system. From our analysis of the star charts, we're in the same galaxy with them, located over here.
Okay, this is promising. If we're in the same galaxy with the humans, let's get Team Wonder working on how we can make contact.
Okay, Kerbinauts, we're just about done. I'm checking the life support system now that we have the module docked, and I'm seeing that we have many more days available, but we'll have even more once we dock up 3 additional living spaces next week. So until then, I will see you later, Kerbinauts.